Se Haristo oli...
This is Sharon, you remember her?
Yes, of course. So nice to see you. Oh, how lovely.
So nice to have you with us.
Very lovely to be with you. Now, I don't know, these bags have been checked to UNESCO.
Yes.
Maybe I shouldn't have taken them off.
Yeah, you could have left them there, but we can do it here.
Because I didn't know, because I saw them.
Yeah, I thought that you probably would take them here. So we go upstairs and
I'll take
check
with me, I'll take this and my violin. The other 4 or 5, the other 5.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we must go upstairs from this way.
Oh look, it's nice.
Hello.
Thank you. How sweet of you. Thank you so much.
It's very nice to see you again.
Very nice to meet you.
You remember this?
Yes, of course.
Yes, actually. Yes, this is Jari.
Very nice. How are you? Nice to see you. Thank you. Lovely. Yes, I didn't know whether they have to go through customs.
Quite all right.
Very good. We have nearly 2 hours.
I have said that this press conference would be closed about at latest 5:15, so we have more than an hour.
It's a lot of talking.
Maybe too much, but that's when the Jyväskylä plane leaves.
Where would you like me?
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to this press conference, and I must say that this is a great moment for Jyväskylä Orchestra, and I think for all Finns to have Sir Yehudi with us in Finland, and especially for me, I want to say that especially with the Jyväskylä Symphony Orchestra, I want to welcome you once again to Jyväskylä to play with us, to conduct the orchestra. I won't use longer than 1 or 2 minutes to say how this all began. Little more than 2 years ago, I met somebody from the agent that represents Sir Yehudi, and I asked her if someday we could have Sir Yehudi to work with our orchestra, and now the day has come. We have concerts this week on Wednesday in Jyväskylä, Thursday in Tampere, New Tampere Hall, and Friday in Espoo here by Helsinki. All details you will find in these files we have here on the table. And maybe I still say that Sir Yehudi had a concert in Switzerland yesterday evening, and will stay till Saturday morning in Finland. Should I say, the word is yours, please.
Oh yes, maybe we could start with the breakfast TV. Okay, breakfast TV, Finnish breakfast TV, morning TV. Yes. I would like to ask you, you played not only classical music, but also Indian, even jazz, and could I say pop music. Which do you like most?
A real journalist's question. First, I want to say that why I'm here, and in response to the introduction which you very kindly gave me on behalf of the orchestra, and that is that I was very, very impressed last time I went up to the far north, and what is the name of the town?
Rovaniemi.
Yes. With the, and I listened to some young violinists here at the airport. At a church you have near here, near the airport. Yes, you have some place near the airport that I heard an orchestra and some young people playing, and was most impressive. I was really impressed with the teaching of violin playing and of the music in Finland. Most impressive, because I was also changing planes, and I was taken to a place near here, between planes. And so when this very warm invitation came, I wanted, of course, to come here again. And I've always loved Finland, and I came here, I remember, for Sibelius's 90th birthday, and played his concerto in Helsinki. And before then, I met him. I don't know if I told you the story when the day I met the great man. It was a lovely autumn day, very bright, and we were sitting on the balcony of his house, and he was absolutely sober, absolutely sober. And we had a lovely conversation, and then all of a sudden he said, "Who do you think is the greatest composer of the 20th century?" I mean, it's a little like your question. And I said, I was a little bit embarrassed because it's a little too obvious to tell a man Sibelius or not to. Then he broke the silence. He said, "Bartók." And I thought that was a really marvelous way of how it was introducing himself. And he then said, "I knew Bartók when we were both students in Berlin." He had the greatest respect for Bartók. Now I must try to answer your question. And you know, classical music, so-called, because classical music is a bad title. Bartók music is classical, and Monteverdi is classical. And Bartók is an evolution, if you wish, of Bach and Beethoven, but with an admixture of the great folk element. He went back to roots. He went back to the folk music of the whole Balkan world, North Africa, Turkey. And even when he was in America, he wanted to feel the world of the United States through their music, and therefore even included bits of jazz in the concerto for orchestra. And so he wanted, first of all, music is the expression of the soul of a people, of a culture. Every culture has its music, and you cannot understand a culture through its words as much as through its music. Because by the time a culture has existed for 300 years ago, let us say, you're not so interested in the words which describe, which say, "I want food," or "I want a table to write on," or that doesn't tell you what they felt and what they thought and what they believed in. It doesn't describe their fears and their sensibilities and so on. So that music is the mirror of the culture and of the composer. So that the music that I played with Ravi Shankar or with Grappelli, I couldn't have played alone because that wasn't my music. I could only play it with a teacher, with a great master of that music. And like an adventure, if I look at a person and say, well, that's a charming person, I would like to speak with her and get to know her and so on and so forth. It doesn't, it's a wonderful satisfaction to one's interest and curiosity and to one's desire to feel for another person and get to know another culture. But it's not one's life, it's not one's wife and one's children and one's place where you live in. So that the music that I play is my family, and the music that I visited are my friends. Now I've answered your question.
Thank you. Violin is quite a refined and an elegant instrument. What did you think of Mr. Nigel Kennedy? A combination of violin, earrings, and punk-style look.
I say, you're a born journalist. Nigel was, of course, at my school for a good many years, since he was 7, until he was about 15, 16, 17, about 10 years. It was during the time he was at my school that, among other visitors, I invited Grappelli to the school. I was already a great admirer of Grappelli, and so was Nigel. In fact, Nigel was more interested in improvising, because he was a very talented child. When he first came, when he was 7, with his mother, he played the violin in tune and with a good sense of rhythm. That's all, but musically. He sat at the piano and played a piece of his own composition, so that he had this creative urge. And he was absolutely mad in love with Grappelli when he came to them. Grappelli was the sweetest person in the world. He took him, as a boy of about 12, he took him to Ronnie's club in London, and where he played nearly every night, and got Nigel to join in. Nigel had in fact been listening to Grappelli records for a long time and playing with them already at the school. And so that was the beginning of Nigel. Now, this sort of role that he plays of being with it, you know, that I find a little less convincing. He's a marvelous musician. He's very gifted. He is, whatever he plays, and that's what I love about him, whatever he plays is always spontaneous and of the moment. He never presents something pre-cooked, you know, and reserved, like very, very many classical musicians learn their piece and then they heat it up in the infrared oven for a few minutes and put it out again. But what I think is the most important contribution of good jazz is that return of improvisation, return of playing from the moment, from the heart, which is the ambition of every artist and should be the ambition of every violinist, because that is has always been an improvising instrument among the folk, the gypsies, even the Chinese and so on. And the Indians too. The violin is one of their improvising instruments. So Nigel became sort of, had this dual path since he was at the school. And then he, wanting to identify himself, I suppose, with the, as a challenge to the establishment, you know, young people always have to challenge the establishment. He began affecting a Cockney accent, which he didn't have. He began wearing these earrings. He began talking and acting in this way, which of course may have increased his notoriety, because if it hadn't, you wouldn't have asked this question about him. And he's become, in his own way, popular because he has carved for himself a little niche, which he has been, he's one of the few. There are now more and more. There are at least 2 or 3 wonderful American violinists who also improvise jazz. And there are quite a few harpsichord players, because even though you might think the harpsichord belongs to an old sort of relic, a period that we have left behind 300 years ago, but that isn't true, because harpsichord music, like jazz, depends on the figured bass, a kind of harmonic structure which you improvise. And the improvising element of pre-classical music, of the music of Dowland or Purcell or Leclerc or Bieber or all those ancient 16th century composers, early 17th century, depended on the improvising gift, because the harpsichord player had to improvise the setting of the harmony, the counterpoint, and he had to embellish the melody, which is what the best jazz players do today. So that's why George Malcolm, Raymond Leppard, and 1 or 2 other harpsichord players are very, very excellent jazz players. So Nigel has fallen into that niche, and he ends his concerts with his jazz. So it brings a new element to the concert stage, there's no doubt. I only hope that he isn't confusing the role with himself. That's my only hope. I don't know yet.
When you were sitting on that balcony with Sibelius,
yes,
and Sibelius said Hardock is the best one, or
that he said?
The best composer,
yes,
in the world, you still agree with him?
I think I do. I think, quite honestly, I do. I think Sibelius is a very great composer. I mean, we don't discuss that. But personally, for me, my attraction to Bartók is very deep, very deep. I love the folk idiom on which he draws. I love his the way he evolved. He evolved very much like Beethoven, from the passion and the wild intensity to the serenity that Beethoven chose in his last quartets. The Bartók quartets are in a way a parallel to the Beethoven quartets. And I knew him in 1943 and 44 when I played for him and met him. And you know the old story, I'm sure, but when I first met him, I wanted him to hear the first sonata for violin and piano that he wrote, and which I was, at that season, playing on my programs. And he was an extraordinary man. He never said, he was by that time already suffering with leukemia, and was very thin, very, very thin. I don't know how he was as a young man, probably a little waited. So there was nothing to do but to unpack the violin, go to the piano tune, and play. And at the end of the first movement, he didn't wait for the end. At the end of the first movement, he got up from his chair and said the following words, which I just repeat verbatim. It sounds perhaps a bit vain to say, but those were his words. He said, I didn't, in perfect English, I didn't think that works would be played as well as that until long after the composer was dead. So, of course, from that moment on, I knew that I had understood him, and he understood me. And then we went on. Fortunately, we played the second and third movements equally well. So it was then that first meeting with him that I allowed myself to ask him if he'd compose a work for me, which he did, Sonata for Violin Alone. I asked for a Sonata for Violin Alone because I thought it was the most modest thing to ask him. I mean, I could have asked him a concerto, and he'd probably written it. But I thought, look, the man is sick. I want to also to help him with a little money, because he was very proud. He wouldn't take it. And you know the check I gave him a few days later, he did not cash until he had finished the sonata the following year. Quite an extraordinary man. And he was so incredibly knowledgeable. He knew so much in botany, plants, animals. He was like a red Indian. If you let him loose in the forest here, he could probably tell you the footprints of the animals that went by. He was a real Naturmensch. I mean, he belonged to nature. And yet he was the most cultivated man in the world. He was both a great creator and a great scholar, because after all, he listed, and his work of listing was done at Columbia University in New York. He listed all the thousands of melodies he heard that he recorded on the most primitive recording instruments. And he established an order of his own. I don't remember exactly. I think it depends on the intervals of the first few notes of a melody. Quite remarkable mind.
We have next week in the Finnish Broadcasting Company a Mozart takes some 16 hours, and we have chosen your recording of the Jupiter Symphony.
Oh, good.
All the recordings because of its outstanding qualities.
The one I did with the Warsaw.
Yes, it's fantastic. Could you tell what sort of relation do you have to Mozart? Or what sort of relation did you have before this year?
Very intimate relation.
Speaking of great composers.
Mozart, I knew him since I was a child, of course. I played him as a young boy. But it's only as I grow older that I realize the incredible greatness of Mozart, that he has this quality which is, I suppose, many great composers have, or writers perhaps. It is the directness and simplicity of a child, this seeing a thing with unprejudiced eyes, you know, just thing as it is, and at the same time, the huge sophistication of a man who knows human nature. And I always say that Mozart depicts, thank you so much, that Mozart depicts men and women and children and humor and tragedy with a sure hand, like Shakespeare. I mean, I don't, in his operas, the portrayal of a character, whether male or female, is quite extraordinary in its accuracy and its poignancy too. It's, you can trust Mozart, and he can do it with the polish and the spontaneity of a salon conversation. I mean, whatever, even when he portrays murder and the most terrible emotions of envy, guilt, rage, confession, tenderness, he can do it with a few strokes, like a Japanese or Chinese artist, a painter, with the perfection. And the interesting thing is it's done so quickly that in the course of 3 bars, of 2 notes, the whole mood can change. The other day, I was accompanying the Mozart Concerto in G major for violin and orchestra, and there was a Japanese, it was at a contest, there was a Japanese violinist, quite a good violinist, and I don't know if you're acquainted, you would be acquainted with the beginning. I said, you should, as a Japanese, understand that each bar he bows lower and lower. Begins with a certain elegant pride. With a sort of little humor and lightness. Now, each one of those bars is different. And sometimes it changes completely in texture, but it's not only the music that changes, it's the mood that changes with him. It's mercurial. It moves like that. Quite extraordinary. Yes. A few years ago I conducted La Clemenza di Tito, his last opera, in Bonn. And jealousies and the murders and so on, it's all in major. There's hardly a passage in minor in the whole opera. It's quite remarkable because everything that he depicts can be said in good company. Now that's a lesson for us, because we think that we have to see blood and we have to see the actual terror. We have to live it before we understand it. But that's not true, because we see so much of it that it doesn't mean anything. We take it for granted that people are going to be gassed and killed and famished and shot, and we take it for granted. Now, we live with it every day, and we have to. But in his day, the description was so subtle and so real, it really is very moving. It's a very interesting thing. It must move, it must proceed on the principle of homeopathy. You know, that the subtle, the small, the least is the most effective and most powerful. And when you use a big sledgehammer, you don't express anything except violence. Well, it doesn't mean anything.
What do you think, what sort of qualities does Mozart demand from the violinist? Does it demand the same sort of qualities like Bach, for instance? Like
well, it's technically different. Totally different. Bach is excepted when Bach is a human being with a family and makes a lot of fun. Some of his cantatas are very humorous and very how to say, not religious, they are lay. But Bach, on the whole, is a composer of great devotion, reverence, and religious feeling. Mozart, Bach speaks about man's relation with God, and Mozart speaks about man's relation with his own kind, with human beings. so it's totally different. Mozart describes, as in a novel, the life in the court and what happens and so on, but with great subtlety. And Bach is above the human. He is pure passion and structure, and of course master of counterpoint and fugue. But Bach demands, how shall I say, a more abstract, but still I don't want to lose the passion of Bach, because that is really, many people think he's dry, you know, that's nonsense. But Mozart requires a great subtlety and a great simplicity too. A child can play both. A child can do anything, really. But it's only later in life that you begin to understand with your mind what the music is about. I mean, when I played Mozart as a child, I didn't know a great deal, very little, about court life in Salzburg. I didn't. But, and most people who listen to Mozart, except in the operas, most people who listen to Mozart on the piano or the violin don't have that idea. But Mozart is not often well played, and Bach isn't often well played today, because there's nothing in our life around us. Maybe there is in Finland, maybe there is in some places where people are left to themselves to think, have a little more peace, a little more time, I don't know. But in the world we live in, the big cities, or where people are living under terror or whatever, there is very little to tell them how to interpret a work of courtesy. Courtesy and reverence. We don't have courtesy and reverence in our world today. So how do you tell them to interpret Bach? And yet, when you play it with the right feeling, you strike an eternal chord in the human being. Because we may not practice courtesy on the streets of New York, but when they hear a work of Mozart that is elegant and beautiful, then they realize it can exist. And I think that is its function today, to remind people of qualities of life that are becoming rather rare in our world. And perhaps it's the function of great music from other ages. I mean, when we listen to great Indian music with Ravi Shankar, we learn of a way of life that's completely different to anything we know. It has something eternal about it. And it has no set beginning, no end. It's not like a piece, you know, like this is a microphone, this is a glass of oranges, and we have a box for everything. If you live in the subjective, eternal sense, then you don't have a packaged work. Our works come packaged to a certain extent, with a beginning and an end. Now less so, but the former works had a proper beginning and a proper end. You knew when the end was coming. And so in that way, the Indian life has no beginning and no end. It's like a river, like the Ganges. It just continues flow, and you get on a little boat and you're carried. Have a good trip.
Yes, thank you very much.
Greetings from Eleanor.
Thank you.
No, I know now several charming Finnish violinists, three to be exact, 3 ladies. And so I'm looking forward to it. And the orchestra is is working with William Boughton, I believe.
Yes, he's an artistic director of the orchestra. 4 years now.
He's a very, very fine musician, a very good friend, and it's he who also is the chief conductor of the English strings.
Played so many things. Is there still something you would like to do?
Oh, yes, especially as a conductor, because I haven't, the repertoire is immense, and I've only done relatively few works. So I'm waiting for various opera houses to say, well, why don't you do Carmen or Tristan or you know, anything, Falstaff or something. It's just a wonderful adventure for me, having played the violin all my life, and having certain ideas about interpretation, of course. And it's like moving into exciting and fascinating territory each time. And so I love it. It's a very adventurous life.
If I may ask you, future plans, are you going to still give concerts, still give recordings, or what?
Whether I continue?
Your future plans?
Well, you know, I have many interesting things I'm doing, musical, but also extra musical, other than musical. I'm interested in many developments in the world and many problems, and right now I'm trying to write an article that the Daily Mail wants very much, because I sent a letter to the Times about a week ago about the deplorable decision of the authorities, government, local authorities, to cut down on music teaching in the schools. And I think music is a child's birthright, just as much as air, good air which they don't have, and good water which they don't have. And the Daily Mail editor was very interested in that and asked me if I'd write a feature article on that subject. So I began it this morning at 5 o'clock, but it still needs, I have to do much more on it. I don't know whether I'll have a few moments or not, but so that's just one little thing. And then I've decided to dedicate the next festival in Gstaad to 2 preventive actions. Last year was Alp action, because I don't know how the mountains in Switzerland, in Finland are, but the Alps are very heavily polluted, and very dangerously so too. The flora and fauna destroyed, the trees are sick, partly through the pollution which comes from the industrial, from England and Germany and so on, Belgium, and the enormous tourist traffic, which is cutting down the small cover of Earth and reducing it so that there are more avalanches and so on and so forth. And there's a very wonderful movement in Switzerland which is becoming international called Alp Action, and which is important for all the alpine regions of the whole world.
Sir, could I please sign this form? Thank you.
Are these the programs?
I'm sorry, for some reason he asked me to sit with you, and for some reason he wants